Houston, we have a podcast. Welcome to the official podcast of the NASA Johnson Space Center, Episode 11, Mission Control. I'm Gary Jordan, and I'll be your host today. So on this podcast, we bring in the experts, NASA scientists, engineers, astronauts, flight controllers, all to tell you all the coolest information about NASA. But we're not the only NASA podcast to do so. As you may know, the Cassini mission came to a close last week on September 15th, 2017, by literally diving into Saturn. It has made some amazing discoveries, collecting critical data on the ringed planet Saturn and the icy moon Enceladus, and even landing a probe, the Huygens probe, on the geologically fascinating moon Titan. If you want to hear more about what Cassini did and learned, check out the NASA in Silicon Valley podcast. Our friends over at NASA Ames Research Center talked with some of the experts on a few episodes, actually, about the mission and what they've learned about the sixth planet and its moons. And of course, a big congratulations to the scientists and engineers who worked so hard to make this mission such a success. So, today, here on Houston, we have a podcast. We're talking about Mission Control with Mary Lawrence. She's a flight director here at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And we had a great discussion about what it's like inside Mission Control, what it takes to be a flight controller and a flight director, how Mission Control has evolved, and what it may look like in the future. So with no further delay, let's go light speed and jump right ahead to our talk with Mrs. Mary Lawrence. Enjoy.
Minus 5 seconds and counting. Mark. Launch commit lights are correct. There she goes.
Houston, we have a podcast.
Well, it's great to see you again. Last time I saw you, we were working on the Everything About MCC video, very fast-paced, and did pretty well on Facebook. 450,000 views. Famous
That's a lot. I try not to think about that, really.
But it was so fun. It was like, we titled it Everything. I mean, it wasn't really everything, but it was like fast-paced information. You got to know more about Mission Control than I guess people would normally kind of find out. And we got to be on the floor. It's kind of different, though, that they didn't have the titles up there, you know, while we were missing that flight director, GC, those kinds of things.
Yeah, that would be good. We'll make improvements for next one, right?
For the next one. Okay, so welcome to the podcast. For this one, we don't have to be as rapid fire, so that's good. We can kind of take our time. But today we're here to talk about Mission Control, and I feel like you're the perfect person to do this because you are a flight director. You're in Mission Control, making all the decisions, and I guess that's sort of what a flight controller does, or a flight director does, right? You're kind of the main person in that room.
That's right. Okay. Yes, the flight director is the lead of the flight control team, so they're kind of the final decision maker and real-time spacecraft operations.
Cool. And you do that how often in general?
I spend a lot of time on console. I'm one of the newer flight directors, so probably spend a little more time on console than some of the more experienced guys that have a lot more assignments.
I see.
But I would say over the past year, I probably pulled about 100 shifts.
Whoa.
So one shift is about 8 to 9 hours long, 8 hours with a 1 hour handover period. And we do that every few weeks. We're on console for a string of anywhere from 1 to 7 shifts, I would say.
Okay, and there's 3 shifts in a day, right? That's just how, because you have that handover period, so 999, you guys can exchange information and pass that on to the next person. So.
That's right. We have the day shift, and then the swing shift, which is 3 to midnight, and then the overnight shift, the fun one. The fun one.
Well, awesome. So I'm really excited about this topic because whenever you think about NASA and, NASA as a whole, really, but also the Johnson Space Center, you think of Mission Control. You think of, the people sitting at the desks, looking at the screens, watching and controlling the mission. And that mission being a lot of human spaceflight missions, especially the ones to the moon. You think about the legendary Gene Kranz, and you think about some of those key players in the Apollo landings and everything else to make the space race happen, or to win the space race and make human spaceflight possible, landing on the moon. So very excited about this. You're on the ground floor. You're making all the decisions, as you just said. Kind of describe the setup. What are you saying when you're sitting at the flight director desk? What's all the data in front of you? What are you looking at? And kind of what's it like without the ambiance, the vibe?
Sure. So like you said, it is kind of an inspiring place to work. So you're working in a hallway where giants of human spaceflight operations walked before you, so
sure.
It's always a very inspirational thing to even walk into the building and see Chris Kraft's name written, in big letters on the side. So
Yeah.
I agree with you from that aspect. And then inside the room, of course, it's very modernized compared to how they flew spacecrafts back then. We have basically computer systems and lots of screens filled with data. That data is coming from the computer network, essentially, on the spacecraft, so on the International Space Station in this example. And then it's sent down through a network of satellites and to more computers here on the ground where it displays data so that the flight controllers can interpret basically the health and status of whatever system they are monitoring.
Okay.
So at any given time, we can see whether or not a light fails on board, for example, or a thruster, or something more significant. We can see if there's a fire on board based on the monitoring of the smoke detectors.
Okay, so
we can monitor all of the data.
Yeah, so that's essentially what you're doing, especially for International Space Station, right?
That's correct.
The mission in this example that you're controlling is the flight of the International Space Station and the operations of that, and the things that you're looking at, and everyone in the room, and I guess outside the room too, and we can get into that later, but they're looking at data, different types of data coming from the International Space Station.
They're looking at data based on the system that they're in charge of. So the spacecraft is kind of divided into what we call systems. So you can think of it like the computer system is one system, the communication system is another, environmental systems. So everything that the crew needs to kind of live on board is grouped under one flight control team. So we have an entire console dedicated to just tracking the stowage on board. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of stuff that we have to keep track of, anything from crew food to replacement computers or replacement electrical parts. We have to be able to plan for things to break and to be able to replace them. So we have a bunch of spares. So we have an entire console position that's really dedicated to tracking all of those things so we know where it is.
Yeah, and the crew too, right? They can call down and say, "Hey, I lost this. Can you find it for me?" And then you have that person on console that can actually find that for you.
Exactly. So everyone is monitoring their data, but they're also they're using procedures, what we call procedures, which are kind of steps that guide you in how to fly the spacecraft in a way. So we're also sending commands from the ground where we can turn lights on and off, or we can hand over attitude control to the Russian segments, and it kind of helps guide us through any operation to essentially fly the space station from the ground.
So, I mean, I'm guessing, based on what you're saying, communication is just vital to all of this. Everyone has to be talking. So how does that work? How is everyone just on like a big chatter, or can you talk to specific people? How does that communication setup work?
You can really talk to anyone you need to. So you'll notice people in that room have headsets on.
Yes.
And we talk over what's called voice loops.
Okay.
So every console position has a loop that's dedicated to them. So if someone wants to call them, they can call in a specific loop. And then there's also loops that everyone really listens to. We call the space to ground loops, or the loops that the crew calls down to mission control on. So everyone's listening to those loops at any given time.
Oh, okay.
Only certain people are unable to talk back to them on those loops, but everyone's listening to those. There's a loop to talk to the flight director, and everyone's listening to the flight director loop. So I generally talk to everyone on the flight loop so that everyone can hear the conversations that we're having and the decisions that are being made. But if I want to talk to someone and not everyone else needs to hear it, I can call on certain other loops. So I can talk to our international partners, for example. I can coordinate with the European flight director or the Japanese flight director or the Russian flight director on other coordination loops as well.
Is that part of your job, is to handle that coordination, or do you have someone in the room that's dedicated to that as well?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
So all of the teams are kind of talking to each other based on their roles and responsibilities. But it is my job to do the overall leading. So we share responsibility with the Russian flight director, and I also have to coordinate with the other international partners kind of all over the world. So.
All right.
Yeah, we're talking to everyone all the time.
Yeah, constant talking. So you kind of talk with everyone on the flight director loops. People are listening back, but so how does that? So say an astronaut calls down, and we'll use the inventory guy, and that's ISO is that console, right? ISO.
That's correct.
So they'll call down and they'll say, hey, where is this? ISO knows where it is, but then you said, only certain people can talk back to them. Who are those people, and how does that work?
Right. So the crew would call down and ask a question. Of course, everyone is listening to that question. The person that has the answer to the question would respond on the flight loop with the answer. And so they would call the flight director and answer the crew's question. Of course, then flight would decide whether or not that is what we want to call up to the crew.
Yeah.
And that information gets also heard by what we call the Capcom, who's the capsule communicator, is what's that short for.
I see.
And they are the ones that talk directly to the crew. So they're talking to one consistent person who they usually know. A lot of times it is a fellow astronaut that sits in that chair. And they're talking to them consistently for, an 8-hour time period.
Okay, so it is kind of a chain. So they'll call to the general space ground. Everyone's listening to that, and ISO's a part of that conversation. But he or she is going to be notifying the flight director, everyone in the room. I understand this message. Here's where it is. But then Capcom's gonna send that back up.
Capcom's going to package the information.
Okay.
And send it up to the crew. Yeah.
So this is kind of like, I guess we're talking mainly International Space Station operations, right? So this is like a normal day. This is people are calling down. You're talking back and forth. People are looking at data. But what other things can you train for? What other things can a flight controller do? The flight controller being the person sitting in mission control, the general person.
Right. Well, we train for all sorts of operations. So the majority of the time, we're on console really for what we call increment operations, which is just day-to-day operations for the crew.
Okay.
And right now, for International Space Station, the goal and the focus for the crew is to perform science on board.
Okay.
So we do a lot of the day-to-day flying of the space station to make sure that the crew can do what only astronauts can do, which is science in space. So they, for the majority of their day now, are doing science experiments and such. So we're just enabling them to be able to do that as part of our job. But there are days where we call them, high tempo ops or critical operations such as EVAs, or we're getting ready for a vehicle to dock to the space station, where there's some really highly coordinated, intense operations that we practice for ahead of time. We spend, weeks to months preparing for those types of operations, and then we have kind of a specialized team or a flight-specific team that will support for the day of the operation. And
that's like when you say EVA, a spacewalk. So this is all coordinating ahead of time. You come into the room, have a dedicated team that knows what's going on for this spacewalk. But then I guess how much of the room changes. You have that dedicated team, but is everyone focusing mainly on their part too? So like you said, one of the systems was the life support, the environmental person, the person that's concerned about it. So are they just looking at that, or is their role changed as well?
Their role hasn't changed. It might expand a little bit. They might be doing additional operations that they don't normally do on a normal day. But they're essentially working the same system, and they're working within the same system boundary that they would and that they've trained for. But there's additional flight controllers that do show up on busier days like that, like the EVA officer, for example. They don't support all the time, but they come in and support when we're actually doing spacewalks or preparing to do spacewalks.
Yeah, because they know the intricate details of what that's going to take, right? They know every procedure, and they can make recommendations based on their knowledge.
They're in charge of pulling off that operation, and they know everything about it and the equipment that it takes to do so.
I like that terminology. You say high tempo operations?
High tempo ops,
cool. So a lot dockings and so what if a cargo vehicle? Obviously astronauts are going to run out of stuff, and then they want new stuff. New experiments, and obviously they need more food, and you need to put fuel and supplies, all that kind of stuff. So that's part of the high tempo stuff, right? You got cargo missions going up and down.
That's right.
You got people going up and down. So it's kind of a dynamic environment. So what other things besides International Space Station can we be? Are you guys thinking about? I know, for example, ep11 a couple years ago. How was that different from a mission control standpoint versus I guess normal operations of International Space Station?
Right. It's really kind of an exciting time for NASA, I would say. We have the International Space Station, so we're doing really great science and learning a lot about what it would take to do kind of deep space operations where we're in space for a long duration period of time. And that's kind of the idea with the International Space Station. It's kind of a platform to try out technology and learn a lot more about humans living in space for a long duration. But it's not, it's only 200 miles in the sky.
Okay.
So it's in what we call low Earth orbit. So we would really need a really big rocket, similar to what we did back in the Apollo days to take us to the moon.
Saturn
to
V,
take
baby.
us to to take us to what we call deep space.
Right.
And that's the Orion project that you allude to. So we did a test flight of the SLS, which is the rocket that they're building that will launch Orion to those deep space missions. So we're, as the operations team, we're just right now learning about the design of the rocket and trying to give input to the engineers that are designing the rocket, designing the capsule that will take us to deep space. So when it's time to design the actual mission and operation to do that, we're ready because we've been working on understanding the capabilities of the spacecraft. And then our team will work to design the rendezvous profile to help take us to wherever we're going to go.
Okay.
And we'll understand a lot about the spacecraft, and I imagine will be structured similar to how we are today, where the spacecraft will be broken up into various systems. That's how it was for the test flight, and we support it from a different room in mission control to support that mission.
So I'm guessing it'll be, a lot of the same folks that have their specialties will be kind of associated with that same specialty in a way on I guess EM1 would be Exploration Mission 1 is what they're calling it now, for the one that they're going to test the SLS, the Space Launch System, the deep space rocket with Orion. So the life support people will be looking at the life support, and the thermal guys will be looking at the those. So you're going to have kind of the similar roles, or I guess
it'll be very, very similar to that. Of
Okay.
course, there'll be a flight director that leads the team, and we already have flight directors assigned to working on those missions.
Oh, cool.
We'll have systems, controlled by flight controllers. The one unique thing that we haven't done since really the shuttle days is the ascent entry aspect of the mission. So the actual controlling of the operations of launch and re-entry. Of course, we partner, with the launch control team that will be in Florida as well for this, similar to how it was in the shuttle days. But
So
we haven't done launch and re-entry since the shuttle program.
Right, yeah, back in 2011. And how did that work? It was, so from my understanding, Kennedy Space Center in Florida, they do all the launch operations. And then it gets to, at what point does Johnson Space Center take over?
So I don't know the agreements that we have for EFT or for the Orion missions yet, but it's shortly after liftoff is where the handover really occurs.
Okay, and you guys are training for that whole process going from shortly after liftoff right through the atmosphere and whatever mission they decide to do.
We're sitting in the control center here in Houston, also monitoring the systems as they prepare for launch, and then shortly after launch they would hand over to the control team here in Houston.
Cool. So for each of those positions, it's not like you just sit down and start looking at data and you know what to do. Obviously, there's going to be some practice that kind of goes with learning that role and becoming, having that title of flight controller. So what does that look like?
It's a fairly intensive training program.
Okay.
So most people that come in have an engineering background. I'd say that's the most common degree. But a space science related background are also common. So you come in already with kind of an engineering way of thinking.
Okay.
And then you're taken within your team to really start learning specifics about the system. So you spend a fair amount of time just learning how the system works. Once you get deep enough into your training flow, you start into what we call simulations, where you practice doing mission operations.
Yeah, working with those systems.
That's right. Yeah. And you're evaluated at various points throughout your training to make sure that you're on track. Okay. And once you pass your final evaluation, you spend some amount of time on console, probably with a mentor or someone sitting next to you that's been doing the job, and they're evaluating how you perform real time. And that takes probably about a year and a half to make it into
Wow.
your first certification.
Wow. I mean, you know, when you're sitting there, you have a lot of responsibility, right? So in these simulations, and I'm assuming you do these quite a few times, right? You know, it's not just one or two simulations. You're
That's
doing
right.
them, and you
Several,
have to
yes.
several. You know, I always equate it to, I mean, you know, I'm not a flight controller, but I was a lifeguard, so I kind of know, like, you have to know a lot of stuff, but you know, you're not necessarily. For the most part, you're sitting and watching at the pool. But when stuff happens, you have to know
be ready.
exactly what
That's
to
right.
do. So I'm assuming it's kind of the same, right? So that's what a
It's very
simulation
similar.
is. A simulation is stuff happens. They throw something at you, and you have to know exactly what to do. And
That's
kind of
right.
go through
We
this
have a
process.
pretty high fidelity simulator that simulates data just like we would be seeing from the actual spacecraft. So it's
Okay.
really hard to distinguish looking at simulation data versus real-time data. The simulator is really good that way. And then we
Yeah.
have a team of instructors sitting in a different building, kind of across campus here, that are putting in malfunctions and have scripted kind of a fun, difficult case for us to be able to handle as a team.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh wow. They throw everything at you, and you got to be ready.
they're really good at it. Yes.
Those are long too, right? You've got to. I mean, you're going to be doing the simulations for a couple hours, right?
They're usually about 8 hours, similar
like
to
a full
our
shift then. Okay.
2-hour shifts. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So when you think about the folks that are at the console, are they flying solo for that console? Or I mean, there's something called a back room, right? So you're gonna have support. You're gonna have extra people looking at the same data,
That's right.
helping you make decisions.
Sometimes.
Okay.
So
sometimes.
on real quiet times, you know, increment operation time periods when it's the weekend in
Okay.
the middle of the night, we try to go down to the minimal amount of people needed. So in those cases, you wouldn't necessarily be talking to a lot of people in the back rooms.
I
But
see.
during those high tempo operations that I was talking about,
Right.
the EVAs, visiting vehicles, or even really busy days on orbit, we would definitely have a lot of people supporting from back rooms, from the MER room, which is essentially the engineering teams. So there's a lot of people that are supporting in other rooms other than the front flight control room
Yeah.
that we're talking to on those same voice loops.
So I just started training for doing commentary for spacewalks, and so I did my first solo run for, I think it was, I forget the number, EVA 41. I think it was the one where Peggy Whitson and Shane Kimbrough were out. And it was the same one where they the shield was inadvertently lost.
Yeah,
so
very exciting.
And exactly, very exciting. And all of a sudden, all these flight controllers and engineers had to come together. You know, they came into a room and they said, "Okay, what are we going to do? Because we don't have a shield anymore. We can't get it." And they figured out that it wasn't going to hit them again or anything. So everything was fine. But they didn't have that piece anymore. They needed to figure out what to do. And so they figured out that they can actually take one of the shields that they just removed from another piece and use that as the shield. And they figured out exactly where to tie everything. Just absolutely crazy, and you got to do that lightning fast, come up with a decision and procedures, and implement it super fast. So I'm guessing these are the things that they're training for.
Yeah, so that was their little mini Apollo 13 moment, right? Everyone's been comparing it to that. But
Right, yeah.
that's essentially what flight control is. It's
Yeah.
You do a lot of training to understand your system in a really in-depth way, so that when something breaks, understanding how it works isn't something you really need to do. We already know that. So it's just a matter of what resources do we have available, and what do we need this thing to do, and to come up with a solution. There's always a solution.
It's absolutely incredible. So, I mean, you know, flight controllers, engineers, all working together. But for you, in your case, you're a flight director. You made it. You know, you're the top dog. You're making those decisions. So what did you study, and what was kind of your path to get to that position?
So it's kind of all about leadership once you get to the flight director position, but it's
Yeah.
also about understanding the capability of your team and understanding the teamwork. So it takes an incredible amount of teamwork and trust to be able to be a flight director and help, you know, make those final decisions. But it's kind of all about the team surrounding me. But I would say my background, I started out in flight control, so I definitely had a good feel of how flight control teams work based on my experience. And then I spent some years in management, so managing people and flight control groups, and
All at NASA?
just getting a little more organizationally intelligent. Yes.
Okay, yeah, all at NASA. And then what was You said mostly engineers. Are you an engineer too? Do you have that degree?
I have a mechanical engineering degree.
Mechanical engineering. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So then you trained. You had some years of management, and then came on as a flight director. So what kinds of training did you have to go through in order to get to that point? To learn what it takes to be a flight director.
So before I became a flight director, most of my knowledge was pretty narrow, I would say, in one specific field. So I spent most of my time in International Space Station operations and the computer system or communication side of the house with a little bit more mixed in. When I became a flight director, it's all about kind of opening up the world around you and learning a little bit of everything, because you really have to be able to understand what anyone is talking to you about so that you can make a decision about it. So similar to, I'd say, the astronauts training flow, we take kind of a high-level classes and courses and meet with a lot of instructors from all over the organization to learn a little bit about what everybody is doing. Yeah,
to know, if you have a problem as a flight director, okay, let's get some information over here. There's certain kind of decision-making processes.
Right. You have to know how everything fits together.
Yeah. And, leadership is definitely, I got to say, one of the top quality. Well, you probably know more than me, but I would say leadership is definitely the top quality of to be a flight director. But what are the sort of kind of personal, personal qualities do you have to have? Do you have to be type A? I imagine like a type A, decisive kind of. Or is there a listening component? A nice balance. What is it? What kind of personal?
It's
qualities?
probably all of those things.
Okay.
I'd say there's definitely some type A's around the building, but you don't have to be. There's a lot of.
Yeah.
I work with a lot of different personality types that are really great flight controllers, and kind of the baseline skill to be able to support mission operations or flight controller operations is. Being able to communicate, being able to work as a team, so you're able to do well listening, but also responding and thinking quickly. You're a good decision maker, you're a good hard worker, and you're able to communicate. That's probably, I'd say, one of the biggest. Assuming that you're competent in your field, obviously you need to study hard to understand your system, but to be able to communicate and understand how everything fits together and integrate with the team. So
I'm imagining like a sort of, kind of quarterback kind of philosophy of that style of leadership and communication and that sort of thing. Along the same lines, if you're the quarterback, are you working, when you say team, are you working with the same team members? Do you have like some core personnel that you always know and have a strong relationship with that makes it successful, or does it rotate so everyone understands the different types of personalities with different flight directors?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
In some cases, we are working with a very specific team that was assigned to do a specific thing. Like a visiting vehicle flight is a really good example. So I'm going to be leading the SpaceX 12 mission that's coming up in later this year, and I have specific flight controllers that are assigned to work that mission. So we will do flight-specific simulations and prep for that mission. We also have a bunch of meetings and work through all the products that are needed in prep for that mission. So I'm working with a specific team in that case. But a lot of days, just increment operation day, normal day in the life of station, I'm working with whoever is assigned to also work that day. So, and I never know who that's going to be, but I kind of like that because every day is a little bit different, and you really have to be pretty adaptable in who you can work with because you're working with all different personalities on any given day.
Okay. So for SpaceX, when you say, for that example, you say, you're going to be working with a core team for that mission. Is it just the grapple operations and release operations, or is there more to that? Is it like It's
mostly that. It's mostly planning up through capture and berthing operations. Okay. We're also the flight-specific team that will be on for the release of that vehicle.
Okay.
But the flight director will also help integrate some of the operations that occurred during that berth time frame. So if there's payloads that are brought up, for example, in the trunk of Dragon, I will help integrate some of the robotics operations to help take that payload out and deploy it on station wherever it goes.
Okay.
For example. Yes.
Is there something on SpaceX 12 in the trunk or no?
There is. It's called the Cream. payload.
Cream, cool.
Yes,
Nice.
it is cool.
What does it do?
It's analyzing cosmic rays,
Awesome.
which sounds pretty awesome. I wish I was a smart scientist to be able to design that, so I don't know too much about cosmic rays,
But you do
I
know how to
imagine that
grab it
science
with a
is pretty
robotic arm
intense.
while a space station is flying at 17,000 miles an hour and attach it somewhere else.
that's
So
the easy part.
That's the-
That's the easy part.
you say easy, but it sounds super hard and cool and complicated. All of the above. Oh, that's amazing. So you guys just know. So you have to know so much to kind of be successful. But going back to like the day-to-day stuff. So for you, you say you can do a shift, anywhere. You can be on for a week and then have a week off and then be on for another. But there's three shifts. So how do you kind of fit that into your schedule? That 1 week you're going to be working at normal, maybe a normal 9 to 5, but then the next week you're going to be working the midnight shift or the Orbit 3 shift where you're there while the crew is sleeping.
Right.
Sort of that's. Is it 3 to midnight?
3 to midnight.
3 to midnight. Yeah.
Yes.
So how do you fit that into your schedule?
So you get kind of used to what we call sleep shifting.
Sleep shifting.
Similar to anyone that does shift work. So a lot of medical field, for example, manufacturing.
Yeah.
Similar to that.
They're very nice. Yeah.
So we'll work, in the office when we're not on console, normal daytime hours, and then as we're preparing to work night shifts, we'll take a day or two to shift our sleep pattern over to work in the night shift.
So do you go to bed like a little bit earlier then, like incrementally, or does it?
Everyone does it a little bit different. Some
okay.
people slam into it. Or they kind of nap before they go in and stay up that first shift and then sleep immediately after. That's kind of how I do it.
Okay.
But some people will kind of gradually shift their sleep the couple days before they'll stay up. And
have you gotten used to it, or do you still find yourself sort of, I'm gonna have to stay up and I'm gonna be tired for this first time, or
it's a good mix of both, I would say.
Okay. Yeah.
I've gotten pretty used to it and
Yeah.
pretty good at what works well for me,
Okay.
and I would say that's probably the case for most people.
Huh.
We also have a team of medical professionals that can help with
Hey.
recommending sleep patterns if you need it.
Nice.
That will work for you specifically, yeah.
Is there essential stuff that you always have to bring with you? So, is coffee just an absolute must, or?
It is for me, yeah, for sure. Especially if you've seen the YouTube video, right?
Yeah, having the coffee with you the whole time. I would be the same way too. I drink a ridiculous amount of coffee, but I'm guessing you have. You can bring food in because you're there, right, the whole time. So you have to bring food. You have to be prepared for the whole rest of the day. So
everything we need to execute is obviously on console. So all of our procedure books and everything that we need from a technical perspective is there. So we don't need to bring any of that stuff. But
right. Okay.
Yes, coffee is essential.
Yes.
There's a very stellar coffee bar that we have available to us, but our breaks are pretty minimal. So whenever we're not in communication with the satellite is kind of when we take our potty and our food breaks. So most people will pack a lunch and run to the microwave in the few minutes that we have.
Okay.
Loss of signal with
there's a handover. We talked about this with Bill Foster, and I'm not sure which episode that's going to be at this point, but Bill Foster talked about that handover of communication and how that works. When you guys are receiving that data and where the space station is, how all the talking digitally, I guess, works. And
right.
I guess those periods can be only a few short minutes, so you got to run and take that break real fast. Otherwise, you got to be in the room ready for any kind of communication. So I'm sure you appreciate those breaks every once in a while.
Yes, for sure.
So let's go back to how in the very beginning you talked about how mission control. It looks modern, and just being in that room, like it's super cool. It's very snazzy. Nice desks, nice computers, but it wasn't always like that. So how has mission control evolved over time? From the classic, when you think about the mission control with the tube monitors and all the buttons, how has that evolved over time?
Well, pretty much as computers has evolved, right? So the computer technology is kind of what drives the capabilities within mission control, and we try to upgrade and kind of keep current with those those capabilities as best we can. So back in the day, they flew to the moon on a single IBM mainframe computer. These days we have networks of computers that are driving the workstations that we use. Of course, we have much slimmer and many more monitors to be able to monitor data, and just the communication resources are just so different today than they were then. So we try to upgrade and make sure we're making use of the latest technology to enable us to do what we do as fast as we can.
Awesome. That's you have all the kinds of very cool technology. You have the monitors. There a lot of it kind of looks like a desktop computer, so it's kind of intuitive in the way that it's designed. But you also have the headset, and you can talk to, like you said, the loops. You can go on whoever you want to talk to there. So it seems it seems like it would work. Is there anything you would want to, anything that you think would make it better? Anything that you're kind of looking forward to in the future, or something that would be, do you want the data shooting directly into your eyeballs, or do you not want that?
It's hard for me to imagine. I don't know. I haven't thought too much about that, but I'll start with wireless headsets. That would be nice, so we could roam around a little bit. Right now we have a little bit of challenges with wireless headsets now, so we don't have that. But so those types of things, and
just to make it more comfortable, really.
Cool TV screens. There's a ton of technology out there that doesn't really fit into our price point budget, but there's some cool stuff.
We got nice projectors now. I'm just waiting for holograms. I think that'll be pretty cool.
There you go.
So what about the culture? There has been quite a culture change, really, in mission control. I would think. What was it like before, and what is it like now? What have you learned over the course of time that makes it what it is today?
So the interesting thing about flight operations and the Flight Operations Directorate that I work for, it's a very traditional organization in a way. So the founding fathers, we talked about Gene Kranz and Chris Kraft. They were kind of the founding fathers of the principles that we're built on, and we still adhere very much to those principles. And really, in that, the actions of even the lowest level worker all the way up through the top of the management chain could have ultimate consequences. So we understand it's a very serious role that we all play.
Definitely.
And that starts getting trained into the flight controllers and instructors and everyone we bring in to the organization kind of from day one. So it's a very serious job, although fun. So we definitely understand that burden, and we make sure that everyone kind of adheres to that level of scrutiny in their day-to-day work.
Makes a lot of sense. A serious culture for a serious job. That's really important. So has that culture sort of translated, because like you said, there's networks, right? You're not only with the systems, but with the mission controls as a whole. It has expanded across the globe. There's other mission controls out there. So has that culture kind of expanded outwards? Is it all the same? Is everyone, about the international, I guess, collaboration sort of side of mission operations?
We hope so. We hope that it influences everyone that we work with, although I will say, every country or every flight control team kind of around the world has their own kind of culture and personality in a way. So we're actually learning a lot from them, and hopefully they're learning a lot from us, being that we've been in the business for a really long time. So we are very traditional in how we approach things from a foundational principle, but we're still learning new things every day. So we're also trying to improve and be agile in our operation and improving how we operate as well. So
a lot has changed. You guys are training all the time, thinking about all these different scenarios that might happen, but then also evolving, like you said, culture, but also the technology, and just things are expanding, things are growing, so kind of fitting along with that. So, but I think that's about all the time we have. So for the listeners, if you want to know more, or you have a suggestion of what we could talk about on this show, or if maybe you have a question for Mary, you want to know more about mission control, just stay tuned till after the music here and learn how to submit those ideas. Mary, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Mission Control, like I said in the beginning, is, I think, one of the coolest parts of NASA, especially JSC, but honestly, just that it's amazing. It really is cool what you guys do, and the things that I think it's because of the operational aspect of Mission Control that we were able to land on the moon, and I think that's really cool, and I think it's just amazing you're a part of it. So I'm very happy you were able to make some time out of your busy schedule. So thanks,
Thank you.
Mary.
It was my pleasure.
Absolutely.
Houston, go ahead.
Stop of the space shuttle.
Roger, 0J, and I feel fine.
Shuttle has cleared the
Became
tower.
a feast for all mankind.
Actually, a huge honor to break a record like this.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Houston, welcome to space.
Hey, thanks for sticking around. So, Mrs. Mary Lawrence is a flight director in Mission Control Houston, and mostly she works missions related to the International Space Station. If you want to know more about what goes on and some of those missions that she is controlling and some of those, high-tempo missions, you can go on nasa.gov/ISS to learn the latest of all the high-tempo activities going on in the International Space Station. On social media, we're very active. On Facebook, it's the International Space Station. On Twitter, it's @space_station, and on Instagram it's @ISS. I think we're verified on all those different platforms, so just go to any one of us, follow us along on our journey, and we'll show you all the cool stuff going on up there. But, Mission Control, we're studying a lot more things and training for a lot more activities, including, and we alluded to, Orion. Go to nasa.gov/Orion and learn everything about that. And, we have verified accounts across all social media, as well as Commercial Crew. nasa.gov/Commercial Crew. Those are the missions where some of our astronauts are going to be flying on vehicles that have been designed and created by commercial companies in conjunction with NASA, including SpaceX and Boeing. And we have some folks that are going to be flying on that coming up here soon. So go to that website and stick along for that journey. And I think we have some social media sites associated with there, too. So I think they're all verified, pretty sure. You just look for the little check mark. Just use hashtag AskNASA on any one of those platforms to submit an idea for the show. Make sure you to mention it's for Houston. We have a podcast, and maybe we'll address your question in the future on one of the future episodes. We have a pretty big bank now of a couple episodes that we've been recording over the past couple months, so it may be a while until we get to your question, but I promise we will. So this podcast was recorded on June 19th. Thanks to Alex Perryman, John Stoll, and Brandy Dean for helping set this up. And, of course, thanks to Mrs. Mary Lawrence for coming on the show. We'll be back next week. See you then.